Nazi rule in Germany was marked by the enforcement of strict new regulations. The ideology of the Third Reich was built on a racial superiority of Germans and the inferiority of the Jewish people, known as the Nuremberg racial laws. Meanwhile, ironically, one of the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, which became a model for the promotional poster of the ideal German soldier, was a Jew. Werner Goldberg is a paradigmatic depiction of how unbalanced the context of the Third Reich was. The life narrative of this guy is a roller coaster of highs and lows, punctuated by the sting of setbacks and grief. But he must be remembered for the rest of time since his acts merit it. The narrative drags back to Werner's parents since they're key to making sense of all that was going on. The boy's biological father was a practicing Jew, but he converted to Christianity when he fell in love with a Christian woman and longed to be with her. Uncle Werner, his mother's brother, was a notorious Nazi and even refused to communicate with his sister, who married a Jew. One issue back then, this marriage led to Werner Goldberg being born a Mischling, which is what people of mixed ancestry were referred to as in Germany at the time. Speaking of the exact date, the boy was born on October 3, 1919. The father's origins were kept a secret to avoid causing any hardship to the family. Werner and his brother Martin were raised as purebred Germans and Christian in a local Lutheran church. After completing his education, the young Goldberg tried his luck in the labor market and successfully managed to get a job at the Schneller & Schneider sewing factory. The Nuremberg regulations of 1935 specified that in order to be considered a quote-unquote complete Jew, an individual needed to have at least 3 Jewish grandparents. If you only had 2 Jewish grandparents and were not actively practicing your Jewish religion, the state would turn a blind eye to your disinterest in Jewish life. And just to reiterate, the point of this was to only progressively get more rigorous. In 1935, the Nazis were not in a position to start their extermination campaign right away, so the rhetoric was somewhat toned down to avoid anti-Nazi feelings from heating up too quickly. This little and temporary loophole allowed Werner to join the German army on December 1, 1938, later taking part in the invasion of Poland alongside a buddy from their childhood named Karl Wolf, whose family ultimately became SS Obergruppenführers. Perhaps these contacts also played a role when the Nazi propaganda began to glorify the exploits of Werner Goldberg, elevating him to the status of the ideal Aryan soldier. With his history, it's easy to see how he managed to stay in the game for as long as he did. This was the time when this famous picture was taken and used to make recruitment posters for the Nazi war machine. Many people probably didn't know where the soldier in the picture came from. The dilemma is that the Nazi party was eager for an attractive idol who would inspire the young people of the nation. Werner Goldberg was the personification of the predestined course of events. Photos of soldiers had their first appearance in the pages of the Berliner Tageblatt, and shortly thereafter, they were spread throughout all of the Third Reich's recruitment posters. At the same time, a glowing inscription that read, "The Ideal Soldier of Germany," was put just below the photo of Goldberg. Werner proved to be a top-notch expert in the production of the documentary. Soon after, he was promoted to a managerial role, which gave him the opportunity to negotiate and sign a number of favorable contracts. But obviously, it wasn't the end of Werner's story at all. Once Germany took over France, it was safe to say that no force in Europe, at least for a few years, could stop them from stepping up their murderous campaign. But no sooner had posters featuring Werner's face surfaced on the streets of the nation than the soldier was forced to resign from his position in the military. The reason for this was a specific edict issued by Adolf Hitler, which stated that no half-breeds were allowed to serve in the Wehrmacht. A change of events of this kind was a kick in the backside for Werner Goldberg, as it meant that he could no longer protect his family against the onslaught of the Nazi Party. The only way out of this predicament was to rejoin his former employment. The fact that the garment factory graciously received the former employee was a boon, as it helped in temporarily forgetting about the recent difficulties that had been experienced. But only for a short time. At the close of 1942, Werner's father was admitted to the local medical facility. Even though the illness wasn't too bad, while he was being treated, the truth about his heritage came out. Obviously, a case of this kind would have immediately drawn the notice of the Gestapo, and as a result, the senior Goldberg was taken into custody. Since his father was sick, he was originally transferred to a hospital for Jews. However, everyone was clear from that place he would go directly to Auschwitz concentration camp. Werner Goldberg did not want to put up with such a fate. Werner, in a fairly audacious move, just made the assumption that on Christmas night, the guards wouldn't bother sticking around, so he simply walked right up and busted his father out of jail. For a long time, the dogs of the Third Reich raved about trying to find a runaway Jew. Both went into hiding, and by 1943, the Nazis, who already had a great deal more on their plates, didn't investigate the subject with a great deal of seriousness. They were the only members of their immediate family to not perish in the carnage of Nazism. Also, Werner was always one step ahead of them, which is one of the reasons why he and his father could effectively endure all of the repressions that unfolded during the Second World War. Unfortunately, he failed to save the rest of his family, which for a long time was burdened by the heart of the former soldier. The war left a lot of scars on Werner's heart. Gertrude, the kind-hearted young lady who would go on to become his wife, was the one who brought healing to the event. Their marriage gave the Goldbergs 3 beautiful children, gave them strength, and helped them remember their father's life. The fact that a Jew was thought to be the ideal German soldier was lost on the leadership of the Nazi Party simply because they'd never given this criterion any consideration in the first place. Lots of those who held senior positions in the Nazi Party were insanely intelligent, yet this was the only desirable quality that they could have even considered included in their criteria. Being blue-eyed, tall, and blonde-haired were all boxes that the majority of the Nazi leadership never fit. Admittedly, Nazi-level scapegoating may not be understood because of the level of complexity the whole process took on. Whatever the reason, things worked out for a Jew in the Nazi establishment. After the war, Werner Goldberg committed himself wholeheartedly into the ministry of the Christian faith. He also joined the German Christian Democratic Union in 1959 and became a deputy. Later, he was entrusted with the management of a commission to review legal complaints. On September 28, 2004, the formerly serving Wehrmacht soldier passed away. 2 years later, the world saw a historical film called Jewish Soldiers of Hitler. The movie brought to light the complete truth about the life of the half-blood who had become both the face of the nation and the fighter against it. Formed in 1862, the Canadian Black Watch, also known as the Royal Highlanders, was one of the most decorated units in World War II. Serving with distinction in Europe and North Africa, the Black Watch fought in some of the most famous battles of the war, including Normandy and Operation Market Garden. Why were they called the Black Watch? It was never confirmed beyond a reasonable doubt, but it's probably that those specters were the lurkers in the shadows. The snipers of the Black Watch Regiment were among the best in World War II. At every turn, they battled like no one else and risked their lives in a way that no one else could have imagined. And one of the most fascinating tales of these battalions unfolded on July 25, 1944, near the Verrières Ridge in Normandy. Some remember it as the 7 Days in Hell. On July 24, 1944, the Allies started Operation Spring, which was aimed at capturing the ridge's heights. But before sending troops on an actual operation, a battalion made mostly of snipers must assume control of the front lines. That is when the Black Watch stepped up. During one of the deadliest engagements of the Second World War, 320 Canadian troops faced off against a German force that was 3 times as large. This was the first time in a week that the 1st Battalion of Canada's Black Watch had seen sunlight before it beat down on their position at Verrières Ridge's foot. They quickly found its rays didn't soothe stress and anxiety. Each of the 320 hollow-eyed, grimy and grim Highlanders, all that remained of 4 battered rifle companies after a week-long baptism by fire, crouched in a muddied, vacant beat field, waiting for the next move. The thick woolen combat attire they wore was covered with splatters of blood, dirt, plaster dust, and ash. Armed with the unholy trifecta of scorching heat, furious conflict, and waves of terror, sweat-soaked armpits, thighs, and necklines stood as witnesses to their horrific dance. Having learned to take nothing for granted in the moments before battle, some of the men fumbled with their buttoned flies or webbed belts to relieve themselves. For some, calming down their tensions meant chomping on some hardtack and drinking rum stored in a hidden stockpile, while some people prayed quietly or sat with their hands on their rosary beads. Others sat forlorn and stone-faced, looking at oblivion. Racked by fatigue that clouded minds, impaired judgment, and left them ragged and sapped of strength, some toyed with trading near paralytic exhaustion for death. The northern slope of Verrières Ridge, covered with dense, tall wheat that reached up to the shoulders of the observer, emerged from behind a shroud of corn. Shining brilliantly in the wind, it highlighted the long, gentle slope up to the German main resistance line hidden below its ridge. The guys left behind the evidence of the previous 4 arduous days and nights behind them. Hill 61, a little hill covered with charred wheat, crushed cars, and hundreds of abandoned slit trenches, stood 900 meters away. The terrain had been torn and pitted by a steady stream of shells. The Black Watch nicknamed the hill Home, braving non-stop German sniper fire, rocket, mortar, and artillery rounds that rained down in torrents of white-hot steel and high explosives, and fighting off enemy patrols who used the blanket of wheat as cover to infiltrate their lines by day and by night. In the shallow valley at the foot of Hill 61, spiraling columns of smoke eddied up from the ghost-like ruins of the conjoined towns of Saint-André and Saint-Martin. The centuries-old mining and agricultural town had been left to ruin, littered with debris and the dozens of unburied dead from both sides. The eerie quiet was punctuated by muffled explosions from unattended fires. Right across the street from was a small group of industrial structures. The Watch thought it was only a factory, ignorant of the 365-meter mining shaft that ran under Verrières Ridge to the iron resources below. But in reality, this was a safe haven for German forces who were fleeing Allied artillery. To dislodge them, it took a liberal dousing of white phosphorus grenades and explosives crammed into ventilation ducts and pithead openings. Now wall panels and sidings that once flashed in the sunlight stood scorched and blackened, riddled with bullet holes and pockmarked by shrapnel. Piles of broken glass glistening in the sun, and the guide ropes that had been cut, dumpsters that had been set ablaze, and carts that had been overturned Doors and window frames hung limply. Dead and dying German grenadiers littered almost every nook and cranny, some dangling from power poles above the 9-meter-high tipple used to load the iron ore, while others were slumped on conveyor belts and garbage piles. In the beat field, not a single member of the Black Watch spoke, or, if they did, they couldn't recall what they said. Resurgent memories of the past met head-on with the soldiers' need to hold on to any last reserves of bravery for the final attack on the enemy. They questioned whether or not the assault would go forward. The battalion was already 4 hours behind schedule for Operation Spring due to a string of unfortunate events, including a tragic entanglement with the Germans on San Martin Island that claimed the life of their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Cantley. They were no longer going to be climbing the open slopes of Verrières in the haze of the pre-dawn light. Instead, they were going to be facing the unsettling possibility of putting on a show in the afternoon. A nightmare for the Black Watch. And when the Watch began their ascent of Verrières' northern hill, they had no idea that an experienced force 3 times their size awaited them beyond the crest. Fieldstone dwellings surrounded by high dirt mounds, capped with dense hedges, and thickets surrounded by fortifications filled with automatic weaponry and anti-tank guns. Getting to the top of the wheat-strewn hill, though, was their first challenge. Canadian Sherman tanks were expected to assist the attack, as they had done in earlier attacks that week. Meanwhile, a whole field artillery unit would drop a steel curtain of high-explosive shells 45 meters ahead of the Watch as they closed in on their position. Smoky clouds would enshroud both sides of the Orne River on the right flank, making it impossible for enemy observation from higher ground. Yet, by the time H hour arrived, none of these elements crucial for success had materialized. Operating under a direct order to press on immediately, and with regimental pride and honor at stake, Major Philip Griffin, the 26-year-old acting commanding officer, reached back with his right arm and, after a silent pause, waved it forward. The soldiers got to their feet in unison as he yelled, "Black Watch, advance!" They dived into the sea of wheat and found the push was more difficult than they'd anticipated as they struggled in the mud. Even though they had fought in similar terrain earlier in the week, nothing compared to the labyrinthine crop covering Verrières Ridge. They climbed the gentle incline, cutting visible trails through the grain that had once housed the troops of William the Conqueror and King Henry V, but now concealed a more menacing horde. Some of the greatest forces that Hitler still had at his disposal waited quietly in trenches and weapons pits, spread out in a loose configuration to lure their prey into a perfectly designed killing field with snipers, machine guns, panzers, and anti-tank cannons. 45 meters into the field, a screen of high-explosive and white-hot shrapnel arrived, erasing any notion of escape or withdrawal. In quick succession, German artillery observers dug in on the crest and the heights across the Orne River Valley, zeroed in on the 3-meter whip antennas of the battalion's wireless sets waving madly above the wheat. German mortar explosions silenced the wireless network in fast succession. With communications cut, the men in the Black Watch could not have been more alone. It wasn't long before German machine guns in camouflaged covers on both sides at the top of the hill came roaring to life. It seemed as if they were using scythe-like accuracy to cut through the wheat with deadly precision, their green and yellow tracer rounds tormenting the guys as they went through their bodies, splitting organs and bones. They bobbed and weaved in the chest-high grain, each trying to avoid drawing the short straw. One by one, they began to fall as the wheat engulfed them, making command and control almost impossible. The cadence of the few soldiers still left on their feet, once calm and firm, now rose sharply. With no hope of stopping, of withdrawal, or of mercy, the soldiers felt an increased sense of urgency. In the seconds leading up to the strike, all anxiety had gone, replaced by a soaring surge of adrenaline. Only the cries of the injured and dying could be heard over the screams of those who were still alive. Once smooth and controlled, their collective glide hastened in pace, turning rapidly into a frantic gallop as they slammed into the German picket halfway up the ridge. When the Black Watch overran their strongholds, they gave no respect to any defenders who were hiding under the grain and were dumb enough to offer surrender. The earth trembled under their feet with each step as corpses and body parts flew in all directions, hitting those who remained on the ridgetop. Sadly, the valiant Highlanders who made it to the summit were greeted by elite panzers and panzer grenadiers who opened fire on them from point-blank range. Cries of pain and death were heard from the injured and dying, begging for help from medics or stretcher bearers, but to no avail. Whimpers soon followed, and then, fortunately, an end to the sound of crying. Acting commanding officers' frantic do-or-die order to push on rang over the uproar, energizing those Highlanders who were still on their feet, drenched in perspiration and enraged by their own deaths. Of the 320 men who made the assault up Verrières Ridge on that summer morning in late July 1944, no more than 20 reported fit for duty the next day. The fate of the remainder was brought into stark relief a few weeks later when the Canadians captured Verrières Ridge in the second week of August. On July 25, 94% of the Black Watch had been slaughtered, wounded, was missing, or taken prisoner, putting them on par with the Royal Newfoundland Regiment on the horrific opening day of the Somme in 1916. The Bretteville-sur-Lys Cemetery, located outside Saint-Thou, is the last resting place for most of the 129 soldiers killed in the attack. The day ended in history as the second most costly for the Canadian Army during the whole of the Second World War, coming in second only to the massacre that transpired at Dieppe 2 years earlier.